East Asia is graying fast. From Japan to South Korea and China, the region is bracing for a demographic time bomb ticking ever louder. For years, attention has focused on the social and economic impact of rapidly aging societies. But there's another unsettling question. As the pool of young people shrinks, what happens to a nation's ability to defend itself? What if countries simply run out of young men to stand guard over their borders?
Japan became the world's first superaged major power in 2005, when people 65 and older made up 20% or more of the population. The Japanese population has been declining for 16 years straight since its peak in 2009. Now, the trend is so alarming that even Elon Musk has commented on it, famously warning that Japan may cease to exist one day as a result of its falling birth rate.
The Japanese military capabilities are shrinking, and also the economic capabilities are shrinking faster than the other countries, and then that creates the perception and the impression that Japan is in declining power. Two kind of possible ways to deal with the demographic change. One is the immigration. For Japan, unfortunately, they were slow about this. There are still the cautious attitudes among the Japanese the population or people about the immigration. Gradually, this impression or like this perception is changing, but it's not like they're fast enough.
South Korea is probably more open to immigration than Japan. Still, that hasn't done much to slow its aging and shrinking population. Now, the country has the world's lowest birth rate at just 0.74 in 2024, and that prompted former President Yoon Suk-yeol to declare a national emergency. The demographic crisis is also hitting national defense. The Defense Ministry says the military has shrunk by 20% over the past 6 years, dropping to around 450,000 troops.
South Korea traditionally has been fielding a large standing army because its existential threat is coming from the north, over land. A lot of people talk about different things, so compensating for the lack of manpower with tech and capital-intensive capability is one thing. Other analysts have been talking about including women in the armed forces, which has been a controversial issue. A lot of people talk about professionalization of armed forces as well, because we have conscription system, and the term of service has been decreasing ever since 1990s from 30 months all the way to now 18 months. So people are saying that we have to make it more professional and outsource all the non-combat functions to the private sector. Traditionally, Korean society, or at least, like military, has been described as having a rather patriarchal culture. But also, if you want to include women in the armed forces, you have to invest in new sort of facilities, and you have to come up with new rules and so on and so forth. So some analysts say that it can be quite costly to include them as well. So both politically sensitive and culturally, we're not sure how that's going to work. And finally, there are some fiscal concerns as well.
Like South Korea, Japan's self-defense forces also consistently fail to meet their recruitment target. Although the SDF has a much smaller size at about 247,000. Japan's pacifist constitution means the SDF has far fewer options than South Korea's military. Mandatory military service for men is not allowed in Japan. The government has decided to raise wages across the board and roll out an upgraded package of clothing, food, housing, and medical benefits, not just to draw in new recruits, but to keep current personnel from leaving. In fiscal year 2023, more than 6,200 members of the forces chose to quit. That's the most in 15 years. The Japanese government has also been trying to make up for the shortfall by investing more in new technology, but the progress has been slow.
Obviously, the technology is one of the way to deal with the decreasing population. And if you invest more in the robotics and artificial intelligence, then probably you could compensate for those population loss. Japan currently under the Takaichi administration trying to invest more in this tech industry, particularly semiconductor and also the artificial intelligence. But the resources are limited, and then we are not really sure to what extent the Japanese government can invest in these areas.
You can't leave out China when talking about East Asia's aging societies. In 2022, China reported its first population decline since 1961. It may have entered the trend later than its neighbors, but the speed at which China is aging is truly alarming. An important demographic indicator is the proportion of those aged 65 and above. When it exceeds 7%, the society is defined as aging society. When it goes over 14%, it's an aged society. Now, France took 115 years to go from an aging society to an aged society. Sweden took 85 years to go from one milestone to the next. China, just 36 years.
So they were formerly the world's most populous country. Now they've been taken over by India. And they've used their population to bolster their military. And that allowed them to do quite a lot. Now, at this point in time, the PRC military, this is the People's Liberation Army, are pivoting away from this big investment on people. They're going, far more high tech. If this trajectory continues, it's hard to predict whether it will, but if it continues, then you could see a PRC that is still big and that's still powerful and willing, perhaps, and able to throw its weight around. Because it's not just the PRC itself. You have to think about the PRC in relative terms. It's countries with which the PRC has disputes will also be growing older, and they may also be less able to sort of defend themselves. One reading of that is that the PRC is trying to lock in whatever it can before it gets old. And so that investment in the PLA is for the here and now.
All across East Asia, major economies have steadily expanded the defense budgets over the past decade, and the trend is expected to continue. Japan has set a goal of raising defense spending to 2% of its GDP, overriding the long-standing 1% of GDP target. South Korea's 2026 defense spending is expected to hit a record, reaching 65.9 trillion won, or about $45 billion. China's defense budget has ballooned to 1.78 trillion yuan, or about $250 billion in 2025, from 720 billion yuan in 2013. Taiwan aims to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2030, from about 3% currently. Why haven't Asian populations made East Asia more pacifist?
Generally speaking, expanding population has been associated with expansionary behavior of states. If you look at the shrinking population, it is not unrealistic to assume or anticipate that shrinking population will lead to a less aggressive policy.
There's this theory that as a population ages, they are less willing to go to war, they are more inclined to pacifist tendencies. I think that theory is not proving out in the East Asian region at all. I think we are seeing quite contrary to the opposite. We are seeing countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, for example, tuning up the rhetoric on military action, modernizing their respective military branches, and most of all, increasing their defense budget. So I think the threat perception plays a large part still on how people are willing to go to war.
Threat perceptions aside, analysts say the rise in defense spending across the region is also driven by a push to automate operations and develop smarter militaries as countries prepare for a significantly grayer future. South Korea, among others, has an ambitious defense goal despite manpower constraints.
첨단 기술을 보유한 스타트업 발굴과 R&D 투자로 방위 산업을 인공지능 시대의 주력 제조업으로 육성하고 방산 4대 강국의 발판을 마련할 것입니다.
There is a bit of a dynamic where countries are taking advantage of this particular window where they are able to automate as much of their processes as possible with technology, with automation, with AI, to seize some kind of advantage that they might have over their adversaries when the time comes that the population shrinkage or the population demography challenges are too big to overcome. 20 years ago, military modernization tend to focus on the tonnage of equipment produced. How many tanks can I buy? How many warships? How large are my warships? How many aircraft can I buy? But today we are seeing a lot more focus on automation. So among the East Asian countries, I think it is very clear that China is leading the way.
During a military parade in September 2025, China showcased what analysts described as a high-tech military force. Several never-before-seen weapons were on display at the parade, many of them unmanned.
The kind of automation and fusion of artificial intelligence into daily doctrines and operational concepts, I don't think there is a military force in the world that is doing it as well as China. But I think China's adversaries have taken notice. I think people have become aware of how much automation and artificial intelligence is playing a role in China's modern military doctrines. We are seeing adversaries in the region, the Japanese and the South Koreans, for example, who are now fusing a lot more of similar artificial intelligence-based solutions into their military equipment when we have scarcely seen this kind of fusion taking place in the decades before.
While automation and intelligent machines will help plug the growing manpower gap facing East Asian militaries, they cannot solve every problem, and they bring new risks of their own.
So one of the fears that we have with regards to the proliferation of technology in the battlefield is how much does a human decision factor into a particular operation. For example, we call this man in the loop. How much decision is being taken by a software to kill a person? When the time comes for the bullet to be fired from a gun, how much oversight will a human being have? So those are all ethical and moral questions that we need to be grappling with.
So South Korean military has been carrying out a series of defense reforms and investing in unmanned and mechanized capabilities has been a big part of it, along with the restructuring of the force structure. But that creates a problem because unmanned capabilities tend to be more vulnerable to attack because it doesn't involve human lives, right? And also Seoul has been investing in naval and air capabilities to compensate for the shrinking manpower and therefore shrinking standing army. So these kinds of investments will create backlash. So for example, if you look at China's recent responses to Seoul's decision to acquire a nuclear-powered submarine, China has not been happy. So you can expect that moving forward, if Seoul invests in air and naval capabilities further, you can see more backlash from China.
And as the world enters a new technological era, how emerging tools such as AI will change countries' behavior in military conflicts is still unknown.
Everybody is trying to advance its technological capabilities in terms of their defense, then they would actually feel threatened by the other countries. And then that is called the security dilemma, like your kind of gain is going to be my loss. So that we need to actually deal with this kind of situation to increase our kind of gain. But if my gain actually goes further, then the other side is going to be feeling threatened. So in that sense, this type of security dilemma is going to be created by the technological advancement in many countries.
If you're able to substitute humans doing the fighting with artificial intelligence, with robotics, with automation doing the fighting, then ironically, because humans are not involved, you may be more willing to take risk, especially if you think that you can control escalation. If the risk profile changes because of automation and artificial intelligence, it may mean that even with a diminished population, states may decide that they have a greater appetite for risky behavior, right? Because it's not people being, put at risk or dying or getting harmed, it's machines that you will then replace.
제가 이제 군대 생활도 했고, 3년, 거의 3년 군대 생활도 했고 하면서 한국군에 대한 자부심이 있어요. 젊은 사람들이 전쟁 안 하려고 그러죠. 전쟁하기도 원치도 않고. 그런데 이제 7, 80대는 아무래도 두렵죠. 경험을 했기 때문에. 그렇기 때문에 아주 보수적이죠. 아까도 얘기했지만 현대화시킴으로 인해서 젊은 사람들이 전쟁에 대한 어려움을 모를 거예요, 지금. 전쟁 경험이 없으니까.
In East Asia, countries have increased their defense spending, yet their militaries are still struggling to fill their ranks because of aging populations. South Korea's military is expected to shrink even more to around 270,000 troops by 2040, down from about 450,000 today. Meanwhile, you have North Korea, which is likely to keep more than 1 million soldiers. So by 2040, South Korea's military could end up being only about a quarter the size of North Korea, which is well below the 1/3 ratio that the US military considers the minimum for planning. And on top of the shrinking numbers, there are also worries about how ready the force actually is for combat.
Some people say that the reason why the organizational culture of the South Korean military has softened is because each child has become more precious to their parents. Another related issue, especially in the context of economically more advanced societies, is that living costs have been going up in these societies, as is the case in South Korea. And military professions are not compensated for financially on par with the rising cost of living.
In Japan's case, the self-defense forces are completely volunteer-based. But with the population shrinking and aging, there are labor shortages everywhere. So young men have many other options. Even part-time jobs can give you a pretty stable, comfortable life. It's not surprising that for most people, even with higher salaries, there isn't much reason to give that up for the tougher, more demanding lifestyle that comes with joining the self-defense force. The government described the current security environment as the most severe and complex since the end of World War II, but conscription is still pretty much off limits in Japan at this point.
If there is conflicts in somewhere in Northeast Asia, where Japan's security was increasingly threatened, and then they need to actually defend Japan in order to respond to those kind of threats. Maybe that could actually create the momentum for the Japanese people to get into the self-defense force. But then, unless there's such a crisis, then it would be pretty difficult because they don't actually feel that it's required. One reason why the Japanese are actually trying to increase defense budget is something about human resources too. They have to have more pensions for the aging self-defense troops, and then because of the increase is not inevitable to some extent.
Unlike Japan and South Korea, China's shrinking troop numbers aren't because they can't find recruits. It's a deliberate part on the government's plan to modernize the PLA. But China's demographic challenge comes from a different place, the one-child policy. That policy lasted until 2016. Therefore, a lot of today's PLA soldiers are probably the only child in their families. This raises a real question. Would China's leaders be more cautious about getting into a big drawn-out conflict, like a potential conflict over Taiwan, if the public has very little tolerance for casualties?
A lot of that kind of perception has got to do with political will and narrative. I think China has been very successful in shaping this narrative that China is under threat, that the Western world is out to get China, and there is existential threat to the Chinese people if we do not commit our resources towards a war effort. So I think there's a lot of support still for military modernization, a lot of support from the parents, despite them having that particular soldier as their only son, for example. I think there's still a lot of strong moral support coming from the people to ensure that China survives the kind of threat that they are perceived to be facing in the future. Even with the People's Liberation Army, you are seeing a change in how they carry out their recruitment operations. China is moving its emphasis from mass recruitment strategies to being a lot more focused actually on quality soldiers who are a lot more educated and a lot more able to operate technologically advanced equipment.
All things considered, as technology evolves and demographics shift, analysts say East Asia may be heading towards a very different security future that requires very different solutions.
I think we have left an era where military might is determined by the number of troops and the number of tanks and aircraft that you can field, but how well you are able to fuse as much data, process the data, and act upon the data as much as you can. So those are the kind of changes that I think will determine the outcome of battles in the future.